Back in Little Italy today. Ironic for today's video for what I'm going to be discussing. I want to tell you that the whole notion that the general consensus preaches that you're a product of your environment. When people see somebody turns out a certain way, the conclusion the general consensus will typically draw is that they're a product of their environment. And I want to explain why environment is not as simple as you were led to believe. So here I am, a Sicilian, and I am naturally drawn to come to have dinner in Little Italy. How ironic. And that's precisely relevant to today's video. So obviously you might want some evidence for why this is the case and why the general consensus is completely incorrect on this. And it's not to say that environment means nothing. That's not the case at all. But the whole idea that's preached that people are products of their environment is completely misleading, very misleading. And they're singing happy birthday, that's adorable. So you might be wanting some evidence for such a bold claim, and we have precisely that. And you'll find this evidence in twin studies. Now, I'm somebody who always preaches that you need to be very skeptical of any studies you see. You need to always try to analyze studies critically. Think about what could have went wrong in this study, how could this study potentially be biased and cherry-picked, and always look at that. And a lot of times studies are very misleading because of this, because they're out to prove a certain point. This is covered in a book that Robert Plowman recommended from his friend Stuart something, I forgot the name again, the science fiction lie or something like that. So it's very important that you, of course, take all studies with a grain of salt. But twin studies are very interesting because when they were first conducted by a psychologist who was actually out to prove the contrary. He was out to prove that actually nurture mattered a lot more than environment. So the bias was actually in the opposite direction. That's when you know a study's conclusion is actually very meaningful, when the opposite party actually comes to the conclusion. And so that psychiatrist actually ended up burying the results until 2066 because they were counter to his entire life's work, proving that actually it wasn't nurture, but rather nature, our genetics. So this is why twin studies are so excellent, not only because of the facts that are undeniable. Two twins have identical DNA. That's a fact, and you could see it literally from your own personal experience by looking at their faces and examining them. It's something that's very difficult to fraud, but not only is it something that's difficult to fraud, but the person who was first conducting these twin studies was actually out to prove the contrary. So that's when you know a study is to be taken very seriously. And these twin studies were very telling because this nutty psychiatrist, before there were regulations put in place to stop this kind of thing, he intentionally had identical twins adopted by parents who would put the children in vastly different environments, completely different environments, some being extremely high class, some being extremely low class, some in the middle. And his goal was out to prove that it was environment. And we saw a similar thing with another psychiatrist with a mice study. He put mice in a controlled environment, precisely the same, variables for everything. And he also ended up finding that counter to his entire life's work, that it actually wasn't the environment. These mice were all vastly different, and it was a consequence of their DNA being vastly different. And as he got older, he wrote some kind of memoir or something, and he said, the older I get, the more I realize I'm becoming the person I really am. And it's so ironic how these people who dedicated their lives to trying to prove that it's environment, that it's nurture, actually end up coming to the opposite conclusions. So this is how you know these studies are are ones to be taken serious. Because again, I'm all for critically analyzing all studies and taking them with grains of salt, but these identical twin studies are very telling. So these twins are put in vastly different environments since, they're babies. They're being adopted by parents that are extremely different. And you would expect that these children would be turning out like their parents and the adopted parents, and it's not the case. The correlation was more similar to the biological parents. There was actually about zero correlation to the adopted parents, like zero similarities. And you'll see, like, even some of these twins, later in life, they did some documentaries on them, some were interviewed. They had so many, niche, interesting similarities. And the more they aged, the older they were, the more similar they became. So this is the evidence. That's the evidence, right? But it's still hard for a lot of you guys to conceptualize this and digest this and accept this. I understand. So I want to give you guys like some thought experiments and some more examples to help you better comprehend exactly why this is happening, because it doesn't seem to make sense, right? We see in reality like people being affected by their environments, right? And it's because these psychologists, these professional psychologists, when they see that, oh, this person is being affected by their environment, they just take that and run with it because it aligns with their career. It aligns with their narrative, and they don't dig deeper. They don't dig deeper into the environment. And what you'll tend to find when you do critically think about what the environment is that's affecting those people, their environments are typically products of their genetics. And so often people will be exposing themselves to environments that are more aligned with their DNA. People have natural inclinations towards certain things, and so they tend to expose themselves to these different environments willingly. And then it leads to the key word of today's video, compounding. That's the key word to understand and digest how this is actually happening. Because again, on the surface, you see environments are affecting these people, but nobody digs deep into the nuance of it. Nobody questions that environmental factor and how that environmental factor came to be. And that environmental factor typically came to be as a consequence of genetics. So it's this runaway positive feedback loop. So as you age more and more, and you're more inclined to expose yourself to environmental factors, not just like what we know as the environment, but environmental factors like certain types of people, certain activities, things that are naturally aligned with who you are as a person, things that are naturally aligned with your DNA. And nothing's really 100% heritable, but these are all predispositions, which is precisely why you don't end up, being exactly who you are right away. It does take time, but as you age more and more, because these are all probabilistic predispositions, think about it like going to a casino, right? If the house always has an edge on you, even if it's something like roulette with a very insignificant edge, or craps with a very insignificant edge, regardless, over a long enough period of time, inevitably the house always wins. No matter how lucky you are, no matter how crazy the odds are, the house will always win over a long enough period of time. Because something just needs to be greater than 50%, a greater than 50% predisposition for you to end up being inclined towards those behaviors. And all of this is very, very nuanced. Life is extremely complex, and this is why it's very difficult to see. And so I kind of want to give you guys some thought experiments to understand how this is, and how this comes to be. And a lot of it has to do with, the parents too, crafting that environment for the child. But then why did those parents craft that environment? It's because the parents carry a certain set of DNA, and the child receives a recombination of those genetics, so it leads to that compounding effect, right? So when people say books are the highest correlation with academic achievement, or whatever the statistic is. On the surface, most psychiatrists they'll assume like, oh, they're a product of their environment. They grew up in a home that was surrounded by books, and it's the books that change them. And it's not that simple. It's actually because they inherited the DNA of their parents. And this isn't always the case, because you're only, on average, like 50% heritable by your parents, and even your siblings are 50% different typically than you. That's why twin studies are so fascinating, because you're 100% the same. You share precisely the same DNA. But so it's not always the case where the child is going to gravitate towards those books, but because it is highly heritable, in many cases this is what occurs, where the parents have the genetics, they have the inclinations to surround the child with books, they have the inclination to prioritize things like academics, to prioritize reading, and so it is likely, it is probable that the child is also going to inherit those similar inclinations, even if not to the same degree. And what that does, it ends up compounding. And so yes, it's an environmental factor, but people are forgetting the vast amount of weight that genetics hold in that environmental factor.
You ask why, why does this happen? And it's what I was talking about before, that the way genes work is we don't program intelligence test scores in our DNA. It allows you to learn more easily, and you can learn more difficult subjects. And then you choose environments that fit that. You like to learn difficult things, so you read difficult things. You argue with people. You talk to people who want to discuss intellectual issues. And so you create environments correlated with your genetic propensities, so that the little differences early in life, accounting for 20% of the variance in infancy, snowball. They increase as you go through life, selecting and creating environments correlated with your genetic propensities. So that's why I think the heritability of intelligence increases throughout life.
And this is just analyzing it in a very isolated variable, right? But this is everything in life. So I was talking with my friend the other day. We were just chilling, watching some Drake music videos from Iceman, neurotypical behavior. But I have these conversations with him too, because he's pretty intelligent and open-minded, and so he can hang with these conversations. And he is somebody who is the general consensus. He's somebody who believes that, environment plays a huge role. And he was trying to counter what I was saying, like, well, what if you put me in one of those environments, where it's a very poor environment. Like, let's say he's a white guy, right? Let's say he didn't grow up in white suburbs or whatever. Let's say we took him and artificially plopped him, not his parents had him there, but we artificially plopped him, like he was adopted by a family in some very low-class, poverty-stricken area that's riddled with crime. And he was like, you're saying I wouldn't turn out like the rest of those kids who end up maybe potentially going to jail and all? And I told him that it's very unlikely he would, because as he ages, he's going to still have his same genetics that are going to have those same behavioral inclinations to guide him towards the environmental factors that would not be relevant to that same community. But on the other hand, the kids that were born in that community, that did share similar genetics to everyone who congregated in that area, that leads to a faster positive feedback loop, the faster compounding effect. And so they're all bound to turn out that way, because their environment is already aligned with what their DNA is aligned with. And that's why sometimes here and there, though, you will see some of them escape. And it's because often they receive some unique genetic recombination. And it doesn't always have to be that the mother or father went out and breeded with someone of a different race or, whatever. Sometimes genetic recombination is just a very fascinating thing. Actually, most of the intelligent people are born from very average parents. That's how the averages work out, because high intelligence is actually extremely rare, and genetic recombination is so completely random that it actually becomes the case where more people on average who are very intelligent derive from very average parents. That might be a little bit hard for you to conceptualize. If I could find the Robert Plowman clip of him explaining that interview, I'll add it.
So that means, on average, the children are going to be they do less well at school than their parents. And a really interesting implication of this is that in every generation, most of the brightest, best children will not come from the best educated, the best test-taking parents. They'll come from the middle of the distribution, from average, parents of average ability or performance. And the reason for that is that everything, like school achievement scores, is distributed what we call in a normal distribution. That's that familiar bell-shaped curve. You take height, anything that you measure quantitatively, serum cholesterol level, anything, it's distributed normally. That means most people are in the middle, and as you go further and further out at the extremes, there are fewer and fewer people. So if you take the parents who did very well, there's very few of them, and their children actually perform less well than the parents, on average, we're talking about. So what that means, though, is that the vast majority of the population's in the middle, and because genetics involves mixing up genes, most of the children in the next generation who will be the best at school will not be from the cleverest parents. They'll be from parents of average ability. And to make this work, we need social mobility. That's the really interesting aspect of it.
I don't know if I'll be able to find it, but anyway, back to my friend. He will naturally have those inclinations if he's plopped in that environment artificially. Like, let's say we artificially spawn him in there. He will have inclinations to guide him towards environmental factors that are not typical in that environment. But there's a more interesting thing that could happen too, which I'll explain in a second, and it's relevant to the Drake music videos we were watching, because I came to a funny realization that that's a perfect example. We'll get into that in a second. But first, on average, what tends to happen is that individual who's artificially placed into that environment, they'll tend to be more inclined to self-expose themselves to other types of environmental factors that the other people in that environment who belong there, whose DNA is more similar to the other people congregating in that environment, he will actually tend to deviate from their typical behaviors, even though he's got those adopted parents or whatever who are having these same behaviors and whatnot. And this is all shown evidence in the twin studies. This is the evidence for it. But I'm just trying to give you guys like the thought experiment for it, like in a hypothetical, so like in layman's terms, so you could kind of understand this and see it. So on average, what would tend to happen in that case, the person's going to be more inclined as they age to expose themselves willingly to environmental factors. Like when they go to school, there might be some other outlier kid who they're going to find more things in common with, and they're going to share their times, they're going to have play dates together more, they're going to be hanging out more, and they're going to share thoughts together more, in comparison to him tending to gravitate towards the kids with other genetic attributes that are more typical of that environment.
So that's how genes begin to work, is you begin to use your environment. You hang out with people who are like-minded. You know, the one grandchild will be hanging out with other kids who read books, who are interested in intellectual conversations.
And that's just one example. Remember, life is very, very complex, and there's tons of these variables literally everywhere.
We have hundreds of measures of the environment that are used in social sciences. Life events, things like financial disruption, stressful life events, are used in several thousand studies. But it's just been assumed that environmental measures are environmental. But what we've shown, many people around the world, these environmental measures show almost as much genetic influence as other psychological traits. And when you start thinking genetically, you say, that's not crazy. What are these measures? It's not the measure of the environment out there, which is the way psychologists used to think of it. The environment's what happens to us. What's going on is that in psychology, our environmental measures are measures of our experience. So life events, it's like financial disruptions, having trouble with relationships, getting in fights with people, losing your job. This is not the environment out there that happens to you passively. You don't have anything to do with it. It's what you do with your environment. And that's where the genetics comes into it. So that's a good example of how a genetic perspective has changed the way we think about the environment. And I believe it's a fundamental principle that the way genes work is through their correlation with the environment, how we use our environment.
So, I don't know, what's another example? Like drugs, for instance. Someone might not have a genetic inclination to not only try drugs, but they might have, some people get more addicted easily to substances than others. He might, like, because of his environment, be exposed to it and, like, it's always around him, but he just doesn't have an inclination to really try it. The same way people born in that environment who share those genetics have a higher inclination to try it. And there is, like, variance here, you know, like it's not completely black and white. Like, if there is, I'm gonna try to focus. This is what I always try to do in public. I try to focus. I try to tune everything out like it's a good practice, because that's life. You gotta tune out other things and focus. But so this is it's not a black and white thing, right? So some people might have a very high predisposition to getting addicted to drugs. Some people might have a medium predisposition. And the people with a medium predisposition, it might take them less exposure, less environmental exposure. But the person who has a high inclination towards it only needs a little exposure. Do you understand that? Like, it's a spectrum. But you take someone like my friend, you put him in that environment, he might not have that same inclination that those other people have, even though he is exposed to that environmental factor. Can this guy get the fuck out of here? Holy shit. And that's just one example, drugs, okay? What about being exposed to things like violence? This is actually where the exception is, because there is an exception to this rule. And Robert Plowman talks about how, I think bikes are cool, so, you know, I ain't even mad about it. I'm just trying to keep my focus. But let's take guns, for example, like violence. Violence, like watching your best friend get killed, or watching your parents die or something, or getting severely beaten as a child and being exposed to lots and lots of beating. These are extreme environmental factors. These are extreme environmental factors, and these are the ones that actually do have an impact. These are the ones that actually do offset the averages. So if everything is for the most part typical, and that even includes growing up in a low-class, poverty-stricken environment, it's still gonna be the case where, you know, what I was explaining this whole video. But there is an exception with extreme environmental factors. Like, if somebody comes into that kid's house and murders his whole family right in front of him, that is sufficient to be an abstract environmental factor. And in that particular case, that is the outlier case. So this is why I said it's not like, it's not completely untrue, but we're not looking at these outlier cases. We're looking at the averages of, like, almost everyone. Because I know violence is very common in those environments, yes, but the overwhelming majority are still experiencing a life where they're not watching their parents get brutally murdered in front of them. It is quite a bit more rare than you'd like to think, actually. I know that sounds obvious to some of you, but it's not obvious to some people who don't understand statistics. You know, they see, like, something on the news and they're like, oh yeah, this happens all the time. It fucking doesn't. These drastic environmental factors are quite rare, even in those kinds of environment. So what would end up happening in the majority of cases with my friend is, over time, he would be willingly exposing himself to environmental factors that are more aligned, more congruent with his biology, and it leads to that compounding effect that will, in many cases, often lead him out of that environment. And this is why, again, we see some people, while not common, who grow up in those environments, even if they are naturally born into them, even if their parents are similar genetically to the rest of the environment, there are some outlier cases where the kid escapes from the environment, and it's because of genetic recombination. Remember, it's all probabilistic. So it's less likely, it's extremely less likely for someone naturally born in that environment to escape it, but it does happen, it does occur. And in the same manner, if you were to take one of those kids from that environment, who is naturally born in that environment, who has those genetics that would naturally be inclined to congregate inside an environment like that and be within that environment, if you take them and put them in, say, a school system that is mostly filled with people who are, you know, less violent, you know, I don't know how to say this, okay? Without getting people fucking emotional and just like not hearing me out on this. Okay, so like tit for tat is a good way to conceptualize this, because IQ isn't the only thing that matters here. It's all behavioral genetics. Tit for tat is a good concept to understand this. So like with tit for tat, the tit for tat is basically like, okay, I'm gonna start off by cooperating, and if somebody else cooperates, I'm gonna continue to cooperate. But if they cheat, then they're gonna cheat too. And in all systems that start on, like, for the most part, equal playing fields, over time, tit for tat will end up becoming the dominant strategy. Tit for tat always wins out. So in like the most successful societies, civilizations, they are primarily dominated by tit for tat. Humans who naturally want to cooperate versus humans who naturally want to cheat. But if a system is like a programmatic system begins with starting with too many cheats, then tit for tat actually won't do well. Tit for tat will get taken advantage of too much, and actually cheating is going to become the dominant strategy. And the people who are overly altruistic and cooperating even after they get cheated, they definitely get eradicated. And that's why in certain environments that you see that are less advanced, that are less productive, cheating is a lot more common. And I use tit for tat as a good example because it's like a broad coverage of many different kinds of cheating-like behavior. You know, like stealing, things like lying, things like violence. That's all like cheating type behavior. And so there's civilizations that are, for the most part, still like mostly cheats, and they can't really escape that because it led to a runaway feedback loop in their genetics, where the people who keep being born, the people who are successful in evolution and having offspring, they're being born with these mostly cheat tendencies. And that's why when you see, you know, people going from island 2 to island 1, you know what that is, they have these mostly cheat tendencies, and they go into those environments that are mostly tit for tat, and they're the ones who are contributing to the majority of the crime. It's not just IQ, it's so much more than IQ. And the fucking engine knocked my phone down. You know how long it took me to balance this shit? Bro, look at this fucking booth setup. Balance it on a fucking light. Yeah, it took so fucking long to balance this. All right. Oh, and you're just gonna shut it off. That's great. Oh, yeah, turn it back on. All right. Be stoic, control your emotions. No problem. Yeah, just linger here. I can see him through the bushes. I can see the movement. He's about to move. Yeah. I can just see, barely. He's making movement. Come on. There you go. Yeah, go ahead, show off, flex to everyone. Ah, very nice. It's okay. He's struggling. It's not his fault. There's a problem with the engine. You know, I forgive him. It wasn't his fault. He wasn't trying to flex. I take back what I said. So, did the engine just fucking die on him? Nah, he's cruising. Anyway, so it's not just IQ. Yes, like, the more competent someone is, the less likely they are to resort to cheating and, like, doing things like stealing. That is true. But there's so much more than IQ. Tit for tat is a good way to generalize this kind of behavior, though, because there's just so many forms of cheating. And so when you take someone from Island 2 and bring them over to Island 1, they're going to be behaving in that same kind of way still, even though it's a completely vastly different environment. And this is why when you add stimulus and tons of money into these environments for decades, nothing fucking changes. It's because you can't fix it with environmental factors, that like artificial environmental factors like stimulus. You can't fix it, but I get it. It's like, what the fuck else are we gonna do? You know, I guess with a little stimulus, you're kind of helping, like, a little bit to a degree, some diminishing returns. But yeah, like, what the fuck else are we gonna do? It's quite a conundrum. I don't even know the solution to it. I don't think there is a solution. Us people, nature, we're just all vastly different. And then when you see the people from Island 2 going to Island 1 into these new environments that have so many more resources, so many more available opportunities, even things like DEI to give them extra help, in many cases, it's just insufficient. So another thing that could happen is that not only will someone deviate from the environment, that's like the more common thing that tends to happen, but if someone is a true genetic outlier, whether they're placed there artificially, like my friend being spawned into there, or a very rare genetic recombination that is very outlier for there, what could end up happening is that organism, because it will occur in all species, actually ends up disrupting the environment. The genetics are so vastly different in some cases that single individual could end up disrupting the entire fucking environment. And this is where you see people like Pablo Escobar. This is where you see people like Frank Lucas. Frank Lucas, high levels of competency. He might not have like the same IQ as fucking Elon Musk, but he has a relatively high IQ, and he has a combination of many other traits that made him who he is, and it allowed him to completely change his environment and disrupt it and completely dominate the environment. But this isn't just in environments like you view in towns. It's also to do with cultural environments, or like these non-tangible environments. So music is a good example, right? So Drake is such a good example of someone who completely disrupted his environment. And there's a certain set of genetics that you need in order to disrupt the environment, because it's not just competency, but you also need the physical genetics to be accepted by that environment and not ostracized when you try to do things like tell people what to do and shit. Like if my friend who's white in a mostly black community tried to take over the black community and like do organized crime in there, there's a high chance people wouldn't listen to him still. The same way somebody like, who's like a white rapper, like G-Eazy, even if he has a higher IQ and higher competency than a lot of these other rappers, he's still not gonna dominate because of the physical factor. But you look at someone like Drake. Drake has the physical attributes to not be dismissed by a majority of the community. He still does get some pushback because he's light-skinned, he's only half black, and also his Jewish background, which plays a big part into his competency as well. That's a whole rabbit hole to go down to as well. Like the Jewish combination of genetics, it's not the highest IQ. You know, the Asians often have the highest IQ, but the Jews seem to have the most unique, is my phone gonna fall? Maybe that's telling me I shouldn't be talking about this, but I don't give a fuck. The Jews have a very unique set of genetic combinations where it's not just high IQ. They have enough of the high IQ, but it's that combined with the other traits they tend to have, which makes the Jew, on average, tend to be the most competitive organism in the human species, the most competitive race for dominating in the modern environment. This wouldn't be the case thousands of years ago, maybe, where physical attributes were more important, or even like in Africa, you know, where physical dominance would be more important. But they have a very unique combination which allows them to tend to dominate and always rise to power in many different various environments. That's a whole topic to go into in itself. But anyway, Drake, so he does have like a lot of those competent tendencies, and it goes far beyond IQ. It's not just IQ. He is very like cunning, and he's very clever. He's very socially adept, and he knows, even though he's high IQ, an interesting thing with music is, in order to make a hit, you need to make patterns with music that the middle IQ can recognize. That's why hits aren't always created by the high IQ people. But high IQ people can dumb their music down, their patterns down, and their lyrics down to be more suitable for the bell curve, the top of the bell curve, where the majority of people reside. And that's where you get a hit. A hit isn't the most sophisticated pattern. High IQ people, that's why they tend to like a lot of indie artists that not a lot of people like. But high IQ people will also like a lot of these hit makers too, because the hit makers know how to create both. It's kind of like how Candace Owens knows how to dumb her content down so the people who are lower IQ could resonate with her ideas. It's not organic. Candace Owens is pandering to the lower IQ as of recently with her like conspiracy theories and whatnot. Believe it or not, she's not retarded. A lot of midwits seem to think this. These like political YouTubers and figures who think they're smart will call Candace Owens retarded, but she's just pandering. She saw something that's working. Anyway, this is quite the tangent. And I talked about this concept more in a video on the main channel called Candace Owens Isn't Actually Stupid, or something like that. But this idea of creating something intentionally with like a lower IQ substance, whether it's a video, like a YouTube video and an idea, or music, which is like patterns. People who are very high IQ can know to pander to the broader audience, while at the same time having the competence to also appeal to the right side of the spectrum and also the even dumber side of the spectrum. And that's why the people with the highest competency could dominate not only the middle, but they could also dominate the high IQ section of it too. And that's why Drake is so dominant, because he knows how to pander and make hits for the regular folks to enjoy. That's why you see like a lot of these other rappers, like they just don't come close to how Drake is dominating the entire fucking industry. And it's like you took Drake, right? This guy who's half black, half Jewish, and he's got such high competency. You take him, plop him into the environment, which is rapping, and he just absolutely dominates it. The same way with sports. When sports were mostly just white people, and then suddenly they allowed Babe Ruth to play baseball, Babe Ruth had the genetic advantages there, and he just fucking dominated. He just fucking dominated. It completely disrupts the entire environment. So yeah, don't think this is like some superiority, kind of purpose I'm making this video. All different races have like unique strengths and weaknesses, and this is just a truth that should be embraced. It should be accepted, but it's not, because it rubs people the wrong way. People get in their emotions, and it's often people who don't have inner monologues who just get that feeling. They get offended and they can't accept these kinds of truths. But yeah, in the majority of cases, people who are put into environments artificially, or somebody who gets a very rare genetic recombination, they'll be more inclined to deviate out away from that environment as they age, and they'll expose themselves willingly to environmental factors that are going to lead to that compounding effect. Or there's the more interesting case where if somebody has such a rare set of genetics, a very unique combination, they could completely disrupt their own environment. They could disrupt the entire fucking environment, and it all comes down to genetics. They're exposed to the same environmental... Motherfucker. They're exposed to the same environmental things, right? But they just end up disrupting it completely. So, again, this is something that's been proven with twin studies, and sure, you could still be skeptical of them now, but as the DNA revolution progresses, that kind of evidence is going to be indisputable. So over time, everyone is going to come to accept this as the truth. And it's beneficial. It's beneficial. Even if as a parent you don't accept this truth, and because everyone has a general consensus idea that kids' brains are like just super malleable and you can kind of turn them into whatever you want, if you try to do that with your child, not understanding the recombination variants, how different they could actually end up being, you're going to end up having a very bad relationship with your child. But the consequences are so much more than that. But at the same time, there's pros, there's benefits to embracing this truth. And the civilization that embraces this truth the most is going to be the civilization that ends up benefiting the most from technologies that are coming out, like embryo selection or whatever. Or that's what we're seeing now. That's what we're seeing now. But wait until we're able to generate eggs, an infinite amount of eggs from skin cells. That's a whole rabbit hole to go down. I made a video on this like 3 years ago, because now instead of choosing from like 5 to 6 potential embryos with only some genetic variants, now eventually when you could come up with unlimited eggs, then even though you're limited to the parent's DNA, because genetic recombination is so variable, so much variance in it, even from two parents who are like 5'10", there's so much variance. With, say you have like 10,000 eggs or 100,000 eggs, even one of them could be bound up to have genetics from far back ancestry and a unique genetic combination to make an NBA kid, even though it's extremely rare. And so currently we're at the phase where like you could only choose like 5 to 6, of the embryos, and you're very limited. And we still are only able to identify single gene patterns and like a couple multi-gene patterns. But as we get more and more data from people getting their DNA sequenced, we'll be able to recognize 10,000 gene patterns. And these are the patterns that really matter, often to do with behavior, not just single gene disease patterns, but patterns that are far more complex. And with the use of AI, where AI is at currently now, AI is at an already by far sufficient place to recognize patterns. What we're missing is the data. More people need to get their DNA sequenced. And as more and more people get their DNA sequenced, then we can leverage AI to create a situation where you'll be choosing from like the 5 to 6 embryos on a television screen, like, oop, I want to pick that, I want to pick that, I want to pick that for my kid, but we're still going to be limited to just those 5 to 6 embryos. But eventually we'll be able to generate embryos in various different ways, generate eggs in various different ways that are not limited to just like 4 to 6 of a pool to choose from. And when there's like tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of possibilities to choose from, that's where we're gonna get so much variance in those recombinations, where one of them is bound to be a highly, highly competent, highly, highly attractive human being. And when we're at that stage, the Pareto distribution is going to be so vastly unequal, it is incomprehensible. Incomprehensible. I made a video on this like 2 to 3 years ago. I think I'm the first one who, like in the world, who's been talking about these potential ramifications of the DNA revolution publicly, like at least on YouTube, and trying to put it in layman's terms. Because, you know, there's books that talk about how this will occur, but I don't think there's many people who are talking about the consequences, what this means. You know that quote from the Bible, Matthew something, you know, for those who have will be given more, for those who have nothing will be taken everything, something like that. That's going to become more and more evident, and that's the Pareto distribution. You think it's bad now? It's going to be on fucking steroids, exponential. It's going to be the haves and the have-nots. And because technological advancement is exponential, this might be a lot sooner than you think, but kids obviously take time to grow up. So at the very least, you have those 2 decades of like those children who are just born, those designer babies who are just being born, then they have to grow into adults. So at the very least, we have like 2 decades until this occurs. And then, yeah, it's just the haves and the have-nots. And the society which embraces this first the most and embraces the genetic truths the most, all it's going to take is like that 1 year advantage. Like 1 year advantage, because everything's exponential, remember? Even like 1 month advantage. The society that embraces this 1 month sooner, because the exponential effects are so drastic, that the civilization, the society that embraces this first, even if it's not a big discrepancy in time, the one who does it first is going to completely dominate the whole world. Currently, naturally, who has the best, most competitive genetic set? You know who that is, and we could go down rabbit holes all about that. But yeah, we started this video talking about how being a product of your environment is a myth. But remember, there are those extreme cases where environment could completely change you and offset you. Now, I want to conclude by sharing Robert Plowman's positive outlook on this. People don't like to accept this idea because it tends to mean they tend to think, well, this means like so little is out of my control, and that's why they don't want to accept it. And Robert Plowman actually argues the opposite. Once you accept this as a truth, it's actually going to allow you to try to curate your environment with this knowledge being an environmental factor. Like you being exposed to this video right now is an environmental factor, and it's a productive one. You're welcome. That is going to allow you to try to curate your environment and manage your predispositions better. Let's say, because being fat is highly heritable, right? It's like 60% heritable. If you recognize that your parents were fat and you have the genes to accumulate fat more easier, because at one point this was advantageous in evolution, that's why so many people get obese so easily. If you recognize that about yourself, you could then try to offset this by trying to curate your environment a bit better. Like Robert Plowman gives the example of like, well, if I'm very like, I try to be disciplined with snacks in my house, but you know, if they're in my house 3 a.m., you know, sometimes I just go have the fucking snack. But if you're conscious of this, you're conscious of your genetic predispositions, you can kind of arrange your environment so that is less likely to occur. But remember, over a long enough period of time, you're out. All right, ciao, Douglas. Good seeing you. Buonanotte. But something that is over 50% a predisposition, remember, like the casino, on a long enough period of time, the casino almost always wins. So it's not 100% though, you know, like weight, 60% heritable. You can kind of fight that, you know? You can kind of fight that, but as you get older and older, you become more like who you truly are, it's going to become harder and harder to fight that. And remember, it's not just the physical genetics, it's all your behavioral genetics too. But yeah, main takeaway, keyword of the video is compounding. That's the keyword to understand what's going on and why environment is so misunderstood. It's because of the compounding effect. These psychologists, psychiatrists, they don't critically think about what environment is because it's disadvantageous to their narrative. They just see environment, they're like, yeah, perfect, it aligns with my conclusion. Why would I look deeper into it? And that's the whole general consensus. Why would they want to look more into it? It's counter to their... When somebody finds something that aligns with their data, they just take it and run with it. There's no fucking critical thinking because that's what's most convenient for them and their career. But if you could be someone who tries to critically analyze these kinds of studies and you try to genuinely be unbiased and even go against your own emotions and your own desires, whatever the fuck you want, like the twin studies, for example, you know, I didn't always think like this. I had to try to look at these studies and say, with skepticism, like, you know, maybe it's not true. But then you find out, holy shit, the bias is in the other direction. This is something that is like really to be taken very seriously. But if that's not enough for you, if you still doubt the twin studies, just wait. Just wait as the DNA revolution progresses, because inevitably the truth will come out. After I finished recording the video, some guy came up to me saying he really liked what I was talking about. He overheard me. And he was like, yeah, we were just talking about twins earlier. Very, very funny you were also talking about it. And yeah, put him onto the Julius Perceiver channel. Very neurotypical guy, so it'll be interesting seeing a regular guy, you know, go down that rabbit hole. I'm gonna stay in touch with him, and if he decides to watch the videos, I'll let you know like what he says about it. You know, this is us like blackpilling a regular guy. But hey, you know, that's that environmental factor. That's compounding. He had the natural inclination to walk over to me, and then I was the environmental factor, but he had the inclination, he had the genetic interest to come up to me. See, that's the nuance in it. Oh, one last thing, kind of like a little cutscene, I guess, that I was thinking about on my way back. I was just thinking how there's some countries, like I mentioned earlier, that are cheat dominated. In the same way, there's some countries, the more advanced ones, which are tit for tat dominated. So I was trying to imagine, you know, what are some countries that are mostly cooperate dominated? Because that happens too. I couldn't think of any off the top of my head. I could definitely think of which ones are cheat dominated. But then I started realizing like there's these little ecosystems everywhere of people that congregate everywhere, even in a country. Like a book club, for example, is probably something that is mostly dominated by cooperate only people. You know, the people who will get taken advantage of, people who get smacked in the face and then reciprocate with love. That's not the ideal strategy in life. Tit for tat is ideal, but I'm just saying they exist too. There's these little ecosystems fucking everywhere, and it's very interesting to think about, and you can try to spot them everywhere. Try to decide which ones are cheat dominated, which ones are tit for tat dominated. Like you go to prison, it's mostly gonna be cheat dominated. And that means in prison, the advantageous survival tactic is cheat in prison. And then sometimes cooperate. So not always cheat, but a strategy which involves mostly cheating. So yeah, you could read the Selfish Gene Principle where it talks about the tit for tat strategies and how while tit for tat is the most dominant in the majority of regular systems. If you're placed in a system where it's mostly cheat dominated, tit for tat isn't the most strategic. So yeah, just go try to find some, leave them in the comments.